A blind man tapped his white cane steadily as he stepped onto the gravel path of Buckingham Palace. Every footfall seemed to echo louder than the last. Tourists parted instinctively, watching in confused silence as he approached the Queen's Guard. The breeze tugged gently at the Union Jack above the gate, and all that could be heard was the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of the cane, and the quiet wonder on people's lips. What is he doing? He stopped just in front of the soldier, just inches from the famous scarlet uniform and tall bearskin hat. He tilted his head up, and in a voice filled with sincerity said, "I came to thank you, because years ago, someone like you saved my son's life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love stories that reveal the hidden humanity behind the Queen's Guard, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more." The afternoon sun drenched Buckingham Palace in a golden light, casting long shadows across the ornate forecourt. Behind the black iron fence, dozens of tourists buzzed with quiet awe, phones raised, capturing every moment of the royal spectacle. They came expecting stoicism, silence, and ceremony. What they didn't expect was the beginning of a moment that would leave many of them wiping their eyes. At the center of the square stood one of Her Majesty's guards, Lance Corporal Thomas Whitmore. At 28 years old, Thomas had seen more than most men twice his age. Behind his rigid composure stood a soldier forged in the chaos of Afghanistan, and later shaped by the flawless discipline demanded of the Royal Guard. For 4 years, he'd held his post at Buckingham Palace with perfect stillness. Rain or shine, heat or snow, tourists yelling or dancing in front of him, he never reacted. He was the textbook definition of restraint and tradition. But today, something unexpected was unfolding before him. Henry Miles, a 67-year-old blind man, had traveled from East London for this exact moment. His life had changed in 1985, the day an explosion rocked Hyde Park. His son Jamie, just 11 years old at the time, had been caught in the crowd. A man in red had thrown himself on top of the boy, shielding him from shrapnel. When Henry rushed to the hospital, he was told Jamie would live, thanks to a guardsman who had walked away before Henry could get his name. For years, that act haunted Henry, not in a painful way, but in a lingering, unfinished one. The uniform became sacred to him, a symbol of honor, but he never found the man who saved his son. And now, years later, after losing his eyesight to an industrial accident, Henry had come with one wish: to say thank you to the symbol that had stood in his heart all this time. He walked through the palace gates earlier that day with help from a local guide. But when the changing of the guard began, he asked politely to be left alone. "I need to do this by myself," he said. The guide hesitated but stepped back. As Henry made his slow approach, the atmosphere changed. Children stopped giggling. Influencers lowered their phones. A group of Italian tourists fell into stunned silence. Everyone instinctively knew they were witnessing something different. Henry's cane tapped gently against the stones as he neared Thomas. He stopped precisely at the yellow line that tourists were never to cross. Somehow, despite his blindness, he felt exactly where he needed to be. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was instinct. Standing before Thomas, he tilted his head upward. "I don't expect you to answer," he said. "I know you're not allowed to, but I also know you can hear me. And that's enough." The wind picked up, lifting the corner of his worn jacket. He clutched a folded photograph in one hand. His fingers trembled. "My boy was saved by a guardsman like you. Maybe it was you, maybe not. Doesn't matter. What matters is what that uniform meant that day, what it still means now." Thomas did not move, not a twitch, not a blink. But behind the dark shadow of his bearskin hat, his eyes watched the man with razor-sharp focus. A child's voice called out softly from the crowd, "Mummy, what's the blind man doing?" The mother whispered back, "He's saying thank you, darling." Henry took a small step forward and slowly raised his hand. He didn't touch the guard. He knew better. But he held the folded photo out, palm up, like an offering. "This is Jamie," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I wish you could see how well he grew up because of a man like you." Someone in the crowd sniffled. Another lowered her phone, overwhelmed. Henry's hand remained outstretched. Seconds passed. Then something subtle, something no one expected, happened. Lance Corporal Whitmore blinked. Once, and then, so softly it could have been imagined, his left boot shifted. Just a fraction of an inch, but enough to suggest he had anchored himself. Not in discipline, not in warning, but in silent respect. No words, no gestures, just a man made of stone, slightly moved by a man made of memory. From across the forecourt, another guard noticed what was happening. He was young, likely new to the post, unsure, alarmed. "Sir," he shouted, breaking the silence, "please step back." A murmur spread through the crowd. Henry startled slightly, then lowered his hand. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to cross a line." Thomas didn't react, but he didn't need to, because the crowd had already seen enough to understand. The new guard began walking over, clearly ready to enforce protocol. But as he approached, something even more unexpected occurred. A senior officer, Captain Bradley Moore, emerged from the side gate. He had been watching, and with one firm gesture, he held up a hand, signaling the junior guard to stop. The officer walked toward Henry with calm, measured steps. "Sir," he said respectfully, "you're not in any trouble." Henry tilted his head. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful." "You weren't," the officer replied. "Quite the opposite." The crowd stood motionless, waiting for what would happen next. The officer reached down and gently took the photo from Henry's hand. "I'll make sure this gets passed along. You have our respect." Henry smiled. A soft, tired smile. The kind only those who've waited decades for peace can give. He nodded and turned to leave. As he walked away, a voice rang out. Not loud, but clear and deliberate. "Sir." Henry paused, slowly turned his head. It was Thomas, still standing in perfect posture, still guarding the gates of royalty and history. But from his lips had come a single word. "Sir." Henry exhaled sharply, emotion catching in his throat. He didn't respond. He simply placed his hand on his heart and kept walking. As Henry's footsteps faded down the path and into the crowd, a silence lingered, one that seemed to press itself against the stone walls of Buckingham Palace. Even the guards on rotation, trained to block out distractions, couldn't help but acknowledge the moment. A blind man had approached the symbol of British discipline and history, not with protest or mockery, but with reverence. And the guard had responded, not with a shout or a step, but with something infinitely more powerful: acknowledgement. Tourists stared, some moved to tears, others whispering to one another. Some left their phones hanging by their sides, forgetting to hit record. Not everything, it turns out, needs to be captured to be remembered. But within the palace's inner corridors, the event sparked more than just emotion. It sparked protocol. Inside a small operations room tucked behind a secured hallway, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Huxley reviewed the incident on the CCTV monitor. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned every detail. "Rewind that 5 seconds," she instructed. The technician adjusted the timeline. The moment Thomas uttered "Sir" replayed in crisp black and white. "Again," she said, "audio level up." The technician obeyed. The word was faint, but undeniable, a break from regulation. And yet, something in the way Huxley narrowed her eyes suggested admiration rather than concern. "This isn't an infraction," she murmured to herself. "This is diplomacy." Still, a report would need to be filed. Meanwhile, back outside, Lance Corporal Thomas Whitmore stood exactly where he'd been posted. Not a muscle moved. But internally, his thoughts raced. Not with panic, not with guilt, but with reflection. He'd been told from day one, "You are not a man in a uniform. You are the uniform, and the uniform does not speak." But something about that elderly man, his words, his trembling hands, the photo he held as if it were a relic from a sacred time, it had touched something deep within Thomas, something no training could suppress. He remembered his own father. George Whitmore had served during the Falklands conflict. A quiet man, never talked much about war, but always carried a silver coin in his wallet with the word honor engraved on it. "We don't raise our voices to be heard," he used to say. "We act with integrity so that we don't have to." Thomas had lost him to cancer 5 years ago. Never got to say goodbye. Never told him that he'd joined the Guard because of him. But in Henry's face, Thomas had seen a reflection of something his father always spoke about: respect earned in silence. And that word he let slip, "sir," was not a breach of duty. It was a tribute. Still, the ripple effects of that tribute were now spreading. Back at Wellington Barracks later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and the sun began to set behind the spires of London, Thomas returned to his shared quarters. His roommate, Corporal Devon Hughes, raised an eyebrow as Thomas walked in. "You made the feed, mate," Devon said, tossing him a phone. "What feed?" Thomas replied, dropping his gear with precision. "Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, you name it." "Someone caught it on camera. The blind guy, the photo, your voice." Thomas frowned slightly and took the phone. The video had already hit over 1.2 million views. The title read, "Royal Guard Breaks Silence for Blind War Hero's Father." He exhaled slowly, then handed the phone back. "I didn't break anything," he muttered. "No, mate," Devon said, standing. "You made something." Elsewhere, Henry Miles sat on the edge of his modest bed in East London, hands folded in his lap. The photo he had carried earlier was now placed carefully on the table beside him. His daughter Eleanor was busy in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. "Did it go how you wanted, Dad?" she asked. Henry nodded slowly. I think it went better," he said with a soft chuckle. "You were brave," she said, bringing over a warm plate. "No, not brave," Henry whispered. "Just ready." Then he paused and turned his head slightly. "You know what I heard?" "What?" "I heard him say something, just one word. 'Sir.' Clear as anything. I know I'm blind, but I'm not deaf." Eleanor smiled gently, placing her hand over his. Henry turned toward the window. Though he couldn't see it, he imagined the grand palace in his mind, the sound of the crowd, the rhythm of the guards' boots, and that unwavering voice in the silence. In the days that followed, the video spread like wildfire. National news picked it up. Radio hosts debated the line between regulation and humanity. A retired general even weighed in during a morning program stating, "There's a time for protocol and a time for compassion." But for Thomas, life went on as usual. He reported to duty, stood in the same spot, saluted at the same intervals, said nothing, responded to nothing, until one afternoon, 4 days after the event, he was summoned. "Lance Corporal Whitmore," the sergeant said at roll call, "report to Commander Huxley's office, now." The room went still. A few murmured under their breath. Thomas felt a rush of heat in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. He walked the long corridor in silence, boots clacking softly against the floor. Inside the commander's office, Sarah Huxley stood facing a large monitor displaying the footage again. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked without turning around. Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am." She finally turned, hands clasped behind her back. "What you did was unorthodox. There are regulations for a reason." "Yes, ma'am. But there's something else we don't talk about much in the manuals." Something harder to train. She paused. It's called judgment. Thomas stood straight, unsure if this was the beginning of a reprimand or something else. She continued. That man, Henry Miles, his son was saved by a guardsman in the 80s. We did some checking. There's no way to know for sure who it was, but the story checks out. Thomas remained silent. Commander Huxley walked over and handed him a printed photo. It was the same photo Henry had carried. You gave something back to this country that day, she said. Not just to that man, but to everyone watching. You reminded them that behind the hat, the uniform, and the rifle, there's a man, a human being. Thomas studied the photo. A boy, smiling in a hospital bed, holding a teddy bear, bruised but alive. Huxley gave a small nod. No punishment, no warning, no paperwork. Just don't forget why you wear that uniform. Dismissed. Thomas saluted. Ma'am. As he walked out, photo in hand, something in his chest settled, like a puzzle piece finally in place. 3 days after his meeting with Commander Huxley, Lance Corporal Thomas Whitmore stood once again in his usual post outside Buckingham Palace. The square was busier than ever. Word had spread. People came not just to see the changing of the guard, but to witness the man now known across the world as the guard who spoke. He hadn't said anything since. And yet, silence had never spoken louder. Tourists took photos as always, but this time their tones were hushed, their attitudes reverent. Children waved shyly. Veterans in worn berets saluted from a respectful distance. Several visitors quietly placed small Union Jack flags along the fence. A young woman even brought sunflowers and stood without saying a word before bowing and leaving them near the gate. All eyes were on Thomas, but he remained completely still, like stone beneath the crown. Inside the palace, a different sort of attention was building. The office of the royal household had received over 600 letters in less than a week. Messages from war widows, disabled veterans, school children, and even international diplomats. One envelope bore a return address from Japan and contained a single line written in gold ink. Dignity needs no translation. And in the heart of East London, Henry Miles, now the quiet symbol of gratitude, was sitting on a local news program. He didn't ask for the spotlight. It found him. Well, Henry, the interviewer smiled kindly. It seems you've touched the hearts of millions. Henry adjusted his hearing aid slightly, then nodded. I didn't do anything special, he replied. I just spoke to a young man who couldn't speak back. But he did speak, didn't he? One word. Henry smiled faintly. A word I'll never forget. He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded the photo once more. A younger Jamie, 11 years old, bandaged but smiling. It had creases now, new ones from his recent journey, but the image still held all its weight. You see, Henry continued, people walk past those guards every day and think they're props in a show, but they're not. They're sons, fathers, brothers. Some have seen things most of us never will, and yet they stand still, so we can move freely. The interviewer cleared her throat, clearly moved. Your son, Jamie, is he aware of the attention this has received? Henry chuckled. He's more surprised than I am. Keeps saying, Dad, you broke the internet. Whatever that means. The crowd laughed gently. Then the camera panned out. Back at Buckingham, something different was happening behind the scenes. At the Ministry of Defense, high-ranking officials were in discussion. We're receiving proposals to include this event in the new induction films, one officer said. They're calling it an example of modern dignity in service. Another nodded. It's not about what was said. It's about the restraint, the poise, the recognition that even a small human gesture can echo around the world. But not all reactions were simple praise. A few hardline voices within the regiment questioned whether the precedent could compromise tradition. If one guard speaks, they argued, what's to stop others? To this, the reply from a senior commander was swift. It's not a matter of allowance, he said, but a matter of judgment. And Lance Corporal Whitmore's judgment was flawless. Within Wellington Barracks, Thomas sat alone in the chapel room that evening. The barracks chapel, though rarely used, offered a quiet space for soldiers to sit, reflect, or simply escape the noise. On the front pew sat Thomas, still in uniform, his bearskin hat laid beside him. In his hand, he held a letter, unopened, sealed with red wax and embossed with a crest. He broke the seal slowly, cautiously. Inside was a handwritten note on thick parchment. Lance Corporal Whitmore, what you did on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace will not be remembered as a breach of protocol. It will be remembered as a rare moment when honor met humanity. The Crown thanks you. Lord Chamberlain of the Royal Household. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He folded the letter, carefully placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and rose to his feet. The next morning, he resumed his position on duty. And just after the changing of the guard concluded, something unusual happened. A man in a military wheelchair was wheeled forward by a nurse. He was middle-aged, missing his right leg, and wore a faded veteran's cap. He didn't speak. He didn't record. He simply sat there in silence, nodding toward Thomas. And Thomas, as always, didn't move. But in that quiet moment, the two men understood each other completely. Later that week, Eleanor, Henry's daughter, received a phone call from a private number. She answered hesitantly. "Hello? Miss Miles?" A warm, clear voice replied. "This is the royal household." Eleanor sat upright immediately. "Oh, yes, I'm here. We'd like to formally extend an invitation. His Majesty wishes to meet with your father." Eleanor covered her mouth in shock. Her voice trembled. He'd be honored, truly honored. The voice on the other end was kind. "He already has honored us." That Friday, Henry Miles, dressed in his best navy blue jacket and polished shoes, arrived at Buckingham Palace, not as a tourist, not as a father seeking closure, but as a guest. He was welcomed inside through the south gate. Eleanor walked beside him, supporting his elbow. Inside a quiet private room, he met not just the king, but several senior guardsmen, some retired, some active. And standing among them, in full uniform, was Thomas Whitmore. No hat, no rifle, just a man. Henry smiled. "So, you do have a voice," he said gently. Thomas smiled back and extended his hand. "Only when it matters." They shook. And for the first time since that day outside the gate, Henry could put the final piece of his puzzle in place. "I never got the chance to thank the man who saved my son," he said. "You just did," Thomas replied. In the silence that followed, there were no medals given, no speeches made, just the kind of moment that becomes part of history, not because of grandeur, but because of grace. As they said their farewells, a photographer quietly took a single photo, Henry and Thomas standing side by side, one blind but full of vision, the other silent but deeply understood. That photo would later be framed and hung in a special hallway within Wellington Barracks. Below it, a plaque, "For those who serve without seeking thanks, and those who give it when the world isn't watching." 2 months had passed since the day a blind man walked up to a royal guard and thanked him in silence. But for the world, that moment hadn't faded. It had become something bigger. Teachers used the story in classrooms to explain courage and humility. Army training academies referenced it as a case study in modern service. Even Buckingham Palace tourism saw a rise, not from those chasing spectacle, but from people seeking something meaningful. They didn't just want to see the guards. They wanted to understand them. And for Lance Corporal Thomas Whitmore, life was both the same and forever changed. He still stood his posts. He still bore the weight of tradition on his shoulders. But now, wherever he went, people nodded respectfully. Sometimes veterans saluted. Sometimes small children handed him letters folded with care. And sometimes people just stood nearby, not to provoke or take selfies, but to quietly observe a man doing his duty with silent strength. One cold morning in early November, a small envelope arrived at Wellington Barracks. There was no return address, just the words, "For L.C. Whitmore," written in careful, shaky handwriting. Inside was a letter. "Dear Thomas, I wanted to write you one more time, while I still can. Thank you for your silence that day, and for your word." That one word reached places in my heart I thought had gone numb long ago. "You've helped me find peace, not just for my son's story, but for my own. I've lived with questions for decades, but after that day I realized I don't need every answer. I just needed one moment of human truth, and you gave it. With love and gratitude, Henry Miles." Thomas folded the letter with care. His hands lingered on the edges longer than usual. Later that evening, after patrol, he asked for leave. He took a train east, then a short cab ride to a modest brick house with white curtains and a garden full of wind chimes. Eleanor answered the door. She didn't say a word. She just nodded and stepped aside. Thomas entered the home, took off his gloves, and followed her into the sitting room. The air smelled faintly of chamomile tea and old wood polish. A photo of young Jamie still sat on the shelf. A pair of Henry's reading glasses lay folded on a side table. "He passed peacefully last week," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry," Thomas replied. "He talked about you every day," she smiled sadly. "About how, finally, someone listened without having to speak." Thomas looked around the room. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small item, a silver coin with the word "honor" engraved on it. "My father gave this to me before he died," Thomas said. "He said it reminded him that integrity isn't loud, it's lived." He placed the coin on the mantel beside Henry's photo. "I think your father understood that better than most." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. "I think he did too." They shared tea in silence. No long speeches, no heavy words, just the warmth of shared understanding. When Thomas returned to the barracks, his fellow guards welcomed him quietly. No fanfare, no questions. Just a quiet nod from Devon, his roommate, and a fresh copy of that photo, now framed and hanging above the common room fireplace. The photo taken during Henry's visit, capturing a handshake between two generations. Weeks later, Thomas received official notice of a special commendation for upholding the crown's values through quiet honor. It didn't come with a medal. It came with a handwritten note from the king himself. And then, during a special ceremony in the palace courtyard, Eleanor was invited to attend as a guest of honor. A guard of honor saluted not just for Thomas, but for Henry too. Eleanor spoke briefly. Her voice echoed across the courtyard. "My father didn't live to see all of this unfold, but he didn't need to. Because in that moment, on that day, he received everything he'd waited for." She paused, then turned toward Thomas. "You reminded the world that dignity is not about standing tall, it's about standing true." The crowd applauded quietly, reverently, and Thomas, ever the symbol of discipline, blinked slowly and returned to attention. But later that night, as the stars blanketed the London sky, Thomas stood once more in the barracks chapel. He lit a candle, not for ceremony, but for remembrance. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told with silence and understood with the heart. Respect isn't about making noise. It's about making meaning. Discipline isn't about being cold. It's about being controlled. And tradition? It isn't about resisting change. It's about carrying the past forward with honor. If you were standing in Henry's shoes, what would you have said? And if you were Thomas, would you have broken the silence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story moved you, please give it